Hello and welcome back for another episode of the season of Try This on Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Dr. Kirstin Lauritsen, and we are in another taper week. We're already at the week before my half Ironman in Salem, Oregon. It's the first time that they're hosting, I believe, a half Ironman in this area. I'm thinking in the past there may have been an Ironman, but they have since, it's been a long time since they hosted that. So, and I don't even think it was in Salem. I think it was in another area here in Portland. So I'm very excited. I get to go and it's mostly a training day for me. This is not going to be a major competition race necessarily. We had agreed that I would do this race as a just another fun, basically like training thing to go do, and not as like trying to make any records. But I'm excited because my coach will be there and he'll be competing, and so will several other friends and some of the athletes that I work with. They'll be there as well, and also doing the race. So I'm excited to just be around a bunch of people that I know and just go out there to have fun. My goal for this race is just to have a really, really good time because of how crazy the Coeur D'Alene Ironman turned out. So my intention is to go out there and just have a lot of fun, enjoy the day, not really do anything, not try to do anything crazy, but just go out and actually have some fun competing in the sport that I've been spending all year trying to improve in and to train for. So that's the goal. My training this past week has been fairly light for the most part. I did a 2-hour bike ride on Friday, which was the longest. Gosh, I think it was the longest I've been on the bike since the Ironman. And I'll tell you that there's quite a mental fatigue that's still there. I just got on that bike and was just like, I'm not really excited about this at all. But, I think that I'm training and I'm doing a little bit of this like movement and stuff just so that like I can be somewhat recovered and repaired for and just ready to go for this half Ironman. And hopefully that will have worked out. I've done some swimming and, been back in the pool and been back in some open water. And it's everything is just feeling slow and not very recovered, but that's okay. I mean, I was expecting that to be that way. So it's just for me, I've been trying to keep the mindset of this is just important to be moving and just to keep the body moving, try to get some recovery, try to focus mostly on recovery. And then we'll just see how it goes. But yeah, this week is a taper week. So everything is super light. It's mostly about resting. And I'm excited. It looks like we're going to have some pretty decent weather on Sunday. So fingers crossed that it is a good day. And it's also a really flat course. And so I'm very excited about that. I just get to go out and just have fun. I don't really have to push, and anything with hills just sounds really awful right now. So, okay. But so what I really wanted to talk about, so that was kind of how this has been going as far as the recovery goes. And I will tell you, it does take time to recover after these big events. And I think what we're going to talk about today is how long it can take as far as recovery goes, and then what it looks like for some athletes. And you're kind of, as you get into this more and more, you can train for longer. You can train for longer, or you can train for more. You can train for getting these together and being able to improve as far as your next events and being able to recover faster so that, you see some of these pro athletes come together and they're going 3 weeks apart, 2 weeks apart. They've got a 70, then they've got an Ironman, and then they've got another, race after that. And within their season, they've done like 5 or 6 races in the summer, right? Starting in like maybe March or April. And then by October, they've done a significant amount of races. And for the most part, they look fairly decent and fairly well recovered. But I think for our athletes that are kind of your normal age group athletes that are starting out, especially, it can take a lot of time after these events. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is what happens when you are doing post-race, like what happens after you've done a race, and what is your body going through, and why does it seem to take so long? So let's start off with what most people say, which is the recovery time can be anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks after an Ironman, or anything similar to that. So like your ultra distances that are maybe like 50 to 100 miles or longer, all of those are going to take a significant amount of time because they can be so stressful on the body. So let's start off with, 4 to 6 weeks. And even then, some people will even say like they think that they're fully recovered, months later, and then they'll come up against a workout or a training session and just, they're like right back to, it feels like almost where they started. They still notice a little bit of the fatigue afterwards. So, so 4 to 6 weeks is like your general, where most of the fatigue comes from. And this entirely depends too on, are you going to be doing other races later on in the year, or is this now going into like your off season and then you're going to start training, maybe in a couple months again from now? And all of that requires a different mindset and a lot of different, pieces, right? So if you're going to be picking up training in because you do have a race, like I do, in 4 weeks afterwards, or if you have one in multiple months after an Ironman, for example, then you are going to work on, picking up some of that movement and going through some of those motions so that you can start getting your body used to moving again and just try to build on top of that. Versus if it's going to be your off season, what a lot of people recommend is you just don't do any training as far as triathlon goes, unless you want to, and you go and do some other like cross training stuff like hiking or yoga or other stuff that gets you moving, but it keeps you from getting like burned out, for example. And then you go into your on season again. And once you enter into that, then you're back into it, but you've had this like mental refresh, right? So there's lots of different ways to look at that. But here are some things that happen within the body post Ironman, and some ways that you can help to improve your recovery and really maximize your recovery through that process, so that if you are going into another race like me, you'll be more prepared. So number one, there were some studies that I was kind of drudging up a little bit as I was preparing for this podcast episode. And some of the things that I found is that they've done some research on what the cartilage and tendon stress is, because obviously like your muscles take quite a bit of stress and injury in many ways, damage to, when you do these events. But their recovery period isn't very long. I mean, muscles can take, delayed onset muscle soreness can be anywhere from 2 to 3 days afterwards, maybe a little bit longer, but your muscles in general are able to recover fairly quickly. But there weren't that many studies that had looked at the tendons and the cartilage. But what they found though, is that when they were looking at athletes after these kind of longer distance events, there wasn't necessarily injury or tissue damage per se to the cartilage. And I believe they were looking in the knees. But what they did find is that there was a bit of what they termed as cartilage stress. And you wouldn't really know, one of the things they mentioned is that you wouldn't really know that you had cartilage stress. Because you won't really feel it, but it can be there. So it's almost like it's an inflammatory response around the cartilage, which is definitely different than an injury. And it can last up to 4 to 6 weeks. So like for me, for example, going into another race, if you have some of that cartilage stress, you could be setting yourself up for the possibility of an injury, because it's just so much load for some of those tendons and ligaments and cartilage and things like that. However, I'm going to put this with the caveat of, we've talked about this in a previous episode, that you can build up tissue resiliency over time, and previously in my years of training, I just didn't do enough of this type of load on my body. So when I would jump into these endurance events, I would get like tons of pain afterwards because my cartilage and my joints and all the things were just not prepared for it. But you can build up resiliency. And that was one of the biggest changes that I saw this year, was that running doesn't hurt. I mean, I even went for a 2-hour run I went for an hour run on Saturday, and no pain. Right. So this could totally be that cartilage stress could be totally different depending on if you've built up that tissue resiliency. And I should note, you don't necessarily have to build that up by running. I've seen many athletes do this by just cycling and weightlifting and building up resilience that way, and maybe doing very minimal walking or running. But there's lots of different ways to do it. Anyway, building up tissue resiliency is part of this process, but your cartilage could take quite a bit of stress from an event like this, and it's important to keep that in mind. Age probably could have an effect on that as well, although I've seen many athletes compete back to back, and they're, in their 70s and 80s. So I don't think age could be a factor depending on the person. I think this is probably a very individualized piece here, but at the same time, I think if you have been working over the last several years on building up that tissue resiliency, that's why you can see so many of these different athletes at many different levels and ages be able to kind of do these events back to back without too much stress. The next point I wanted to talk about is your immune system and what seems to happen post Ironman. They do recommend that you get some type of movement, like walking, like some sort of recovery after an Ironman, but then you really want to focus on rest for a couple days afterwards. At least from what I was looking at from the studies that I was looking at, was that competition has not really, when you do these events, it doesn't seem like there's any acute health risks. So especially for athletes who come well prepared, that are well trained, they're well supplied as far as nutrition and fueling and all of that jazz. So, you're not necessarily seeing a ton of like upper respiratory infections or people getting very sick afterwards, although it can happen. But there does seem to be some immune suppression within that post-race recovery period. What they meant by that is that they found that your white blood cells can drop, as well as your immunoglobulin A, so IgA suppression, which is along most of your mucosal barriers. They found that there was a drop in kind of all of those areas, especially the week after an Ironman. So what that means is that you may see you could get sick, or you could notice some type of symptoms that are suggesting that your immune system is having a little bit of a tougher time recovering. It is important to remember, though, because one of the things too that I experienced myself actually is that when your immune system takes a hit like that, you can see the expression of viruses and things that you've maybe had in your body around. Your immune system isn't able to keep them in check. So that's one thing just to keep in mind, is that you can have a little bit of you can see your immune system in many different ways pop up during this time frame. On top of that, though, you can have a pretty big effect as far as like nutrition goes on this system too, if you know what to do. And that's what we're going to talk about at the end of this. This is some of the things you can use as far as like nutrition goes and rest in order to really optimize and keep your immune system healthy and up there. As well as some things like vitamin D, for example, that commonly are deficient, and how that can impact this part of the immune system. The other thing on top of this, as far as the immune system goes, is that what they found was, especially within a few days, depending on the event, but sometimes 20 minutes up to several days, they found oxidative stress increased in a lot of athletes after an Ironman distance competition. What's really interesting about that, though, is that declines really quickly. So like the muscle damage and metabolic changes that are associated with all of that, within 5 days after an Ironman, all the oxidative stress markers were back to pretty much normal. What oxidative stress is it's when your body undergoes some type of like inflammation. And it also is, so you get oxidative stress from multiple areas. Oxidative stress could come from like reactive oxygen species, which we get from when you like grill your food and you get those black marks on your food, which most people associate with taste. Those can produce something called AGEs. And then those, when they get into the body, can create reactive oxygen species. And then it contributes to this overall like oxidative stress. In addition, when you get any sort of pollutant or any sort of toxin, anything like that can create oxidative stress. And then you can create oxidative stress just from your body doing its thing. So one of the things that happens within a cell is there's these little organelles called mitochondria, which create ATP, which is your energy source, right? And when they go through their normal process, they're like normal metabolic process, they create oxidative stress, which is really interesting, which is why your vitamins and minerals and all of those things are so important, including protein. That's why they're super important, because they help to mitigate that stress. They essentially neutralize it and then are able to get rid of it. So it's no wonder that oxidative stress would increase post Ironman, right? Because what are those mitochondria doing all day is they're being metabolically active because they're trying to give you as much energy as possible to get you through the day. So but here's the problem though, when oxidative stress gets out of control. So in an inflamed person, if you added that oxidative stress on top of an already inflamed person, that's when you can see a lot of just like breakdown in the system overall. It's just there's so much stress for the body. So that's something to keep in mind, as well as if you are deficient in some of those micronutrients, it may take quite a bit longer for your body to recover, because your body's going to have to be trying to get that oxidative, trying to get those vitamins and minerals and micronutrients that help to mitigate the oxidative stress and neutralize it, trying to get it from any source that it can, which is why deficiencies it's important to keep that as part of our training over a year, is trying to mitigate any deficiencies as we go into these major events. Yeah. So that's one of the biggest things I wanted to talk about, is just because those significant raises in oxidative stress can have a pretty inflammatory effect on the body. And then we can see that, across the board in other areas. Another thing that leads right into this, which I wanted to talk about, is how this can not only affect your muscles in your gut. So one of the things I thought was really interesting, we've talked about the GI tract before, and that you can see inflammation start after about an hour and a half to 2 hours in. If you don't have amino acids circulating throughout the bloodstream and through the gut, then we can see a little bit of this intestinal permeability start to form. And that's when we see a lot of athletes get things like gut pain or GI distress, and you stop being able to use your macronutrients as well, because your digestive system is just starting to break down a bit, which please keep in mind, it heals up within, 4 to 6 hours, usually for most people after that. So it's not something that you need to worry about per se. However, there are lots of people that are going into these events already having intestinal permeability. So we're just adding on top of it. So one of the things I thought was really interesting is that what they found in one of these studies was that changes in muscle cell damage strongly correlated with changes in the zonulin concentration when they were looking at the GI tract. And what happens is when your gut gets inflamed, zonulin can be released. And then that is part of what creates this inflammatory response around the cells. And then that creates intestinal permeability. So what they were looking at is that with these longer lasting, maybe lower intensity or higher intensity, but these long lasting efforts, as far as like Ironmans and ultras, all that jazz, all those different types of events, well, they can significantly influence your intestinal barrier. So like the health of that. And that seems to correlate with the level of muscle cell damage along with that, which is interesting because when you really think about it, I've talked about this multiple times on this podcast in its entirety, is that like the body is so connected, right? Like there's so many different, we want to think of these things like, okay, so if we just need to repair the muscles, then then we just need to do these things in order to repair the muscles. And how do we do that? Well, we do that with protein. We do that with, certain types of vitamins and minerals and micronutrients and all of that. But that protein has a significant effect on the GI tract as well, and can be anti-inflammatory to the gut and help to repair the GI tract too, as well as that intestinal barrier and the mucosal lining, which, going back to that immune system piece, right, with the IgA decrease after an Ironman, all of these are connected. So if you are looking at it from the perspective that I look at it, like rest is obviously very important, but nutrition is ever more important because it's part of what helps the entire body recover after an event like this. Okay. And then the last one, before I get into some of the bits and pieces, as far as like what you can do from the nutrition side of things and rest to optimize your recovery, is one thing I've talked about actually a lot this past week, is like in my practice and things like that, is talking about central nervous system fatigue versus your peripheral fatigue. So, peripheral meaning going out to your body. So like your limbs, your hands. So something that's further away from your brain and your spinal cord. So everything going away from there is your peripheral nervous system, and everything in the brain and spinal cord is technically called your central nervous system. And one of the things that's super interesting about these is that about Ironman events is that they can create this sort of sense of like central nervous system fatigue. And I can't explain exactly what it feels like, but like your muscles all feel recovered, and you're doing these. I've done this before after my 70.3 in 2019 in Whistler. It was like a month and a half later or something like that. I mean, it was a significant amount of time later. And I did a sprint triathlon, a local one where my parents live. And I remember being on the run, just like dying. I just felt so awful. And I was wondering, I was like, how is that even possible? Because, I'd done a lot of things right that day, and I assumed that I would have been recovered. But there is this feeling that your body gives you that it's just like this dragging, icky kind of like fatigue where your body just doesn't feel like it wants to go anymore. Like just let me stop. And it's not your muscles. It's something going on, within the nervous system. And one of the things that I was looking at when I was preparing for this is what actually happens between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system after these types of events. And for definition wise, the term peripheral fatigue, as far as your nervous system goes, is usually to describe the force reductions due to anything that goes on outside of what we call the neuromuscular junction. So it's closer to, it's like more in the muscles. It's further away from the body. It's more about like, more or less the muscles being able to contract, and you being able to do those types of movements. Whereas with the central fatigue, it's more about these kind of pieces in the brain and in the nervous system that are called motoneurons. And there's still quite a bit that they're studying as far as the whole pathway of all of these things. I don't think they've quite decided on how some of this all works and they're still researching how the brain and the central nervous system and then the muscles all can interact with each other. But what was super interesting about that study, though, was that they were talking about how in certain amount of fatigue of the muscles themselves, they can create this fatigue, like the communicating to those motor neurons in the nervous system. And that was just creating this overall general sense of like, of just overall fatigue. Like your body was just not going to get to those levels after that, which I find so intriguing because it really does explain why and how stressful these events can be on the body, and not just on your muscles and your joints, but on your actual nervous system, which is why recovery is really important. Okay, so the next piece is, what can you do after all of this is put together? Now you've learned all the different ways that these events can affect your body. What can you do from a nutrition standpoint, at least, and a rest standpoint to try to mitigate some of that? So, and I'll tell you a little bit of what I've done. So caloric intake in general needs to increase significantly over the entire week post Ironman. So you cannot, even after a very, very long training day, we've talked about this too on this podcast a bit, even after a very, very long training day or hard training day, you cannot get enough calories in to mitigate some of that caloric deficit that you've got yourself into by doing those longer events and longer, harder training days. So the idea is that over the course of the week, we should be being able to balance that system out. It doesn't necessarily have to be done on that day. And keep this in mind, right? So like these Ironman events or some of your longer training days might be 6 hours, could be 8 hours, depending if you're going off for a really, really long ride, or 4 hours even. It's a significant portion of the day. And yes, you're fueling in the middle of it, but you're not necessarily going to be spending that time eating a meal and multiple meals. So the point is that when you get to the other side of that, in order to help balance that out, we need to be eating quite a bit of food. And it turns out it's not necessarily just post Ironman in that week after, but also several weeks afterwards, making sure you're eating enough, especially if you're going back into training because you have an event coming up in 4 weeks to a couple of months. Making sure you're keeping that calorie load higher is really, really important. And that's not just from the perspective of like eating higher fatty foods, but that's looking at both carbohydrates and protein, and keeping up with the same things we've talked about, which is lots and lots of protein around the workout itself, but also throughout the day. And post Ironman, making sure that you're getting in some source of protein and carbohydrate frequently throughout the day. So maybe instead of doing larger meals, doing smaller meals throughout the day that overall add up to quite a bit might be a little bit easier on your system. I know for me, I had no desire to eat afterwards because it was like 11 p.m. at night. So that was not great. So then the next day I was like, well, I've got to eat all the things. But at the same time, especially after a day like that, it can be hard to get a lot of food in one sitting, because I really feel like your stomach just does weird things during those events. So smaller meals throughout the day can be the most helpful. And then on top of that, staying hydrated. So that was another piece that I wanted to mention, is that hydration is key, especially if you're going to be going into training, the next week, which is what we did. Staying hydrated and trying to balance that system back out after a day of an Ironman or an ultra event is pretty vital. And always remembering too that your nutrition and your hydration isn't just backfilling, but it's also setting you up for the next day. I know it was last week that I got distracted and busy by work. And then that led to me not eating as much. And then on, I think it was like Wednesday, I ended up on the couch by the end of my work day, and I just was exhausted. I still had a bike to go, but I just felt like super heavy chest. Like, so it did not feel very good. So I did not train that day. And then I was also reminded to make sure that I was eating enough, and I really wasn't, it's hard for me to eat throughout my work day, because my appointments are usually back to back. So, I have a tendency to go a pretty significant amount of time without food in that day. So I definitely felt that the next day, which was a really good reminder, because that's like nutrition in and of itself is a very key piece to making sure that you're able to keep going, right? And making sure that you're recovering, but also getting you to that next event, if that's what's coming up. The other thing I wanted to mention before we wrap this up is finishing this up on that micronutrient deficiency piece, because vitamin D is one of the most important vitamins, I would say, when it comes to overall recovery, because it affects your joints, it affects your bones, it affects your muscles, and it also affects your immune system, particularly for your lungs and your upper respiratory tract, basically. So all of the lungs and that whole system. So, and what they found is that, and so not only are a lot of Americans overall deficient in vitamin D, but athletes are very commonly going in to events deficient in vitamin D. And according to some of these studies, and on top of that, and part of that is because they, a lot of people train indoors over the winter time. You're not getting as much exposure outside. Maybe you live in a place like I do, where it rains a lot and we don't really see the sun, nor can we really get vitamin D from the sun during certain parts of the year because of our latitude. So there's lots of things behind that, but so many people go into a lot of these events deficient in certain micronutrients, and then that also compounds, a lot of that oxidative stress, a lot of the other stress on the system, and can delay recovery, because again, your body needs a lot of those micronutrients in order to do these processes to help you recover. So that was a really important thing for me these last couple of weeks, was to try to make sure that I was staying on top of some of the supplements that just help me to kind of fill those gaps in a little bit faster, but also just nutrition wise, getting a lot more balance, and also trying to take some rest, making sure I'm sleeping enough, making sure that I'm not just exhausting my body with chores and things to do all day long, trying to prioritize some time just chilling out. So there's a lot of pieces like that. And then, and I'm going to end this here, but I just talked about vitamin D, but things like iron, things like vitamin C, all of the different types of vitamins and minerals that we need can all have different impacts on the body. And it just depends on the athlete and the person, as far as what your normal patterns are, maybe what your genetics are, that you might need a certain amount more than somebody else. These are all things that you can track down and you can look at. But then also remembering too, that like your GI health and all of this, it really matters as well. So that can have a pretty significant impact on your recovery, as well as lowering inflammation and being able to continue doing these events, especially if you have multiples on the board or on the calendar. Just making sure that you have all things in check so that you can go out there and have good days. These are some of the ways that you can do that. So that's our episode for now. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow With Sports on all social media channels, and make sure to share this episode with anyone you think may love it. If you can also follow me at Dr. Kirstin on Facebook and Instagram. You can also find everything at drkirstin.com. If you'd like to reach us with any comments or questions about this episode, you can at info@wispsports.com, and you can always leave a direct message with us on social media as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back next week. Take care.